Let's dig a little deeper here. That Darius and his son, Prince Xerxes, would hold lotus flowers in their hands while entertaining an international convention of royal guests, under the shade of rows and rows of massive lotus columns, only highlights the central and often overlooked role of the sacred lotus in Persian ritual. Historians have yet to agree on the botanical identity of the homa-plant, but they do concede that Soma and Homa are one and the same botanical entity. And various scholars have recognized that there has never been a detailed investigation on the shared characteristics and mythic attributes of Vedic Soma and Persia's Homa. So bearing in mind that we identify the Soma plant of ancient India as the Asian lotus, as Nelumbo nucifera, then we might expect scriptural and iconographic records in Iran to agree with this botanical determination. One of the more informative texts on these matters is the Homa-plant of the Younger Avesta, a scripture that dates from the first millennium BC, which probably reaches into Iran's prehistoric past. A yasht, which refers to a class of Zoroastrian text that records a liturgical worship by praise, circumscribes ritual protocols, mantras, and mythical explanations for the worship of a specific deity. So obviously the Homa-plant is dedicated to the praise of the Homa plant or the Homa spirit. This spirit benefits the worships of Mazda by its healing powers and its ability to confer fertility, long life, and ultimately immortality on the user. And needless to say, all of these healing powers are consistent with Vedic descriptions of the Soma plant's effects. The Homa-plant begins with a scene that recalls the first moments in which Homa, a spirit portrayed in this mythic text as a quasi-personified deity, appears first before Zarathustra, and then addresses a group of dragon-slaying allies of Ahura Mazda, including the likes of Vivangvant, Atwa, and Trita, all of whom are well-known members of the Vedic pantheon and basically secondary figures in the Persian pantheon. Golden Homa himself can also assume the role of a Virathagnya, a dragon slayer, who hurls his Basra, they say, the Sanskrit equivalent to a Vajra, a thunderbolt, against green dragons that belch forth poison. Repeated references are made to some familiar characteristics of the Homa plant in this and other scriptures, such as the plant's spreading shoots and tendrils, their bending shoots, their sweet-scented stems, or more emphatically, the plant's golden body and golden eyes. The latter characteristics are also confirmed in the Ghosh Yast, the Mihir Yast, and the Ashi Yast. To quote the Homa-plant, "Now you grow of milky whiteness, and now you grow golden, and forth your healing liquors flow for inspiration of the pious." Since several texts describe the stem's saps in terms of milk or butter, or symbolically as the holy cow's fat, as is also the case in countless scriptures of prehistoric Vedic hymns from India, these references must surely relate to a white latex-producing plant. And to be sure, all of these metaphorical attributions agree, again, with Vedic descriptions of the plant god Soma. As regards past attempts of linguists to identify Homa, it is probably fair to say that most language specialists have settled on the opinion that the Homa plant was likely a shrubby, cone-bearing, leafless plant known as the joint pine plant of the genus Ephedra. This is a subject we take up in a little bit more detail in our video on Soma and the Vedas. As a botanist, I just have to say that this plant, the joint pines, are unlikely possibilities, even if two reasonable arguments have been made to justify this determination. The most compelling argument relates to the well-known stimulating virtues of this plant group, insofar as Ephedra plants are known to be the commercial source of a well-known precursor for the synthesis of amphetamines, that precursor being ephedrine. So joint pines do, in fact, produce powerful stimulating compounds. And perhaps just as convincing is the fact that a few modern-day Mazda worshippers of the 20th century were known to have employed ephedras in the performance of homa rituals. Nevertheless, as we shall soon see, joint pines unlikely have anything to do with homa rituals in antiquity, given that this plant group is never golden in color, nor lustrous in aspect, nor sweet-smelling. Nor, I might add, in biogeographic terms, does this plant group thrive among the historical sites that were famous for the worship of Mazda. The radiance and brilliance of golden homa plants can only be interpreted as allusions to a flower, not only because the golden aspect of the plant is described as the sun, but also because the plant is said to be sweet-scented. To quote the Homyast, "Yea, I praise the lands where thou dost grow, sweet-scented, swiftly spreading the good growth of the Lord." References in one of the oldest recorded yasnas of the tradition, the Haptang Haiti yasna, some 3,000 years ago, describes the homa plant as growing on high, but growing on high from the waters of the Caspian Sea, and with a golden flower. To quote from James Darmastetter's translation in the Sacred Books of the East collection, "We worship the good mind in the living and the spirits of the saints, and we sacrifice to the fish of 50 fins, and to that sacred beast that stands in Vorukasha," the Caspian. "And we sacrifice to that sea of Vorukasha where he stands, and to the homa, golden flowered, growing on the heights, yea, to the homa that restores us and aids this world's advance. We sacrifice to homa that driveth death afar." And the description here of the site at which we encounter homa, growing from the Vorukasha, agrees in no way with the arid habitats that we expect to find ephedra plants living in. And of course, references to a flower in this passage precludes any possibilities that the plant in question was a cone-bearing ephedra plant. The placement of the homa plant among aquatic habitats, while simultaneously suggesting that the plant grows among golden mountain peaks, presents, obviously, a botanical inconsistency. Because, not unlike Vedic Soma, a number of Mazdian scriptures suggest, in a mythic context, that homa grew on mountain tops. The Homyast states, for example, that homa grows on the, quote, heights of lofty mountains and in the gorges of the valleys, while stating in a later passage, praising thy lofty mountains where homa branches spread. Now that is a pretty strange plant, one that grows on mountain summits and also in the valleys and gorges of mountainous terrain. Because few, if any, plants in nature occupy such different habitats, especially when we consider the mythic heights to which the Magi's plant was said to attain. The Yas note, for example, that birds have carried thee to the peaks above the eagles, to the mount's extremest summit, to the gorges and abysses, to the snow peaks ever whitened, unquote. These allusions must be relevant in some way or another to the botanical nature of the homa plant or the soma plants, but they do seem to be at variance with natural history, given that fresh materials of the homa plant were harvested in situ by Mazda worshippers on the banks of rivers or lakes. In fact, the most famous Zoroastrian historical sites occur invariably in close proximity to the shorelines of rivers and lakes, the so-called Aryan Weg, which are generally far removed from snowy mountains. The summit to which the aforementioned passages refer, Mount Haraiti, is described in various texts as a lofty pinnacle that rises from a wide-formed aquatic abyss called the Vorukasha Ocean. Haraiti is an abbreviated reference to the mythical mountain, Hara Beresaiti, meaning the lofty golden mount. Hara meaning golden in Avestan, just as Hari means golden in Sanskrit. And translators usually equate this legendary mountain with one of several high peaks that rise from the southern banks of the Caspian Sea, most notably the Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, because they are often snow-covered. Upon this mountain's golden summit, readers are informed in the Vendidad that Homa drinkers encounter the proverbial Chinvat bridge to heaven or hell. So this mythical peak of the Persian Magi recalls the golden and holy mythical Mount Meru of the Indian Aryans, which is also described, incidentally, as exhibiting the shape and color of a massive golden lotus flower. And in like fashion, and pay attention to this because we're trying to separate historical fact from mythic allusions, Persia's famous world mountain, Haraiti, is also said to be a lofty and yellow landform, these being a combination of characteristics that are used to describe, actually, the tree of life of the Zoroastrians as well. To quote the Homyast, "We worship the yellow one, the lofty one. We worship the Homa who causes progress. We worship Homa who drives death afar. Yea, we worship all the homa-plants." If we dig deeper into the mythic details of the widespread Aryan tribes of southern Europe and Central Asia, we find that an Indian cosmic eagle builds its nest upon the summit of Mount Meru's golden peak in ancient India, just as the same holds true for the Zoroastrian tree of life. The mythic image of Holy Mount Haraiti is essentially a mirror image of Mount Meru and Mount Mandara in Hindu tradition, as each of these summits is a proverbial peak of the law, of cosmic law, a home to the gods and a key location at which, according to the Zoroastrian Sroshast, the plant god Homa smites the deceitful devas and upholds the hallowed barsam, the bundle of homa stems that will be readied for sacrifice. So it seems that the mythical world of Mazda worshippers conflate the roles of their mystical world tree with a mythical world mountain. To bring this point home, consider, for example, a typical refrain of the Sroshast. "We worship Sraosha," that being one of the Amesha-Spentas, the god of obedience, "the blessed, whom Homa worshipped on the highest height of high Haraiti. He Homa, the reviver, and the healer, the kingly, of the golden eye, and of gracious words. We worship Sraosha the Blessed, whose house stands with its 1,000 pillars, as victorious, on the highest height of high Haraiti, self-lighted from within, star-studded from without." So, the use of these allegorical refrains as a botanical source of information is problematic, to say the least, and for several reasons. For one, they suggest an unlikely biological proposition of placing the Iranian and Indian plant of the gods on snowy mountain summits, or yellow mountain summits, just difficult to understand in terms of natural history. Or more importantly, as we shall soon see, and this is key, Homa was an aquatic plant, which sprang directly from the waters of the Caspian Sea and its many tributaries. Now, golden Mount Elborz of Iran may well have been visible to priests that harvested their homa stems on the coastal plain of the Caspian Sea. But there is no way that a plant that is found on the coastal plain also occurs on top of a frosty mountain summit. It just doesn't work like that. So the homa plant is as enigmatic in Persian mythology as it is in Persian history. Yet the identity of the plant is key to understanding just what was so attractive to this faith for the Central Asians. For without it, how will we ever appreciate the reason why so many Aryan communities deified this plant for thousands of years? Given the essential role this plant played in the spiritual lives of famous magi, one might just expect that the plant sacrament would turn up in some way or another in religious imagery that covers the pillars and facades of Persepolis and Susa. Wouldn't you think? And just to reiterate, there is only one plant species that has ever taken the form of a tree of life and or a holy sacrament among these famous sites. And this plant, in particular, shares all the mythic attributes that the homa-plant exhibits in the scriptures of the Zoroastrians. Moreover, this plant is depicted hundreds of times, nay, thousands of times among the ancient ruins at Persepolis, Pasargad, and Susa. In terms of the natural distribution of the homa-plant, it seems apparent that Homa and Soma had a broad distribution in ancient Asia, and was presumably quite common at this point in human history, having served a common purpose for both Persian and Indian priestly communities for thousands of years. Yet as a mythical plant, it is said to sprout from the middle of the earth, much as Soma springs from the navel of the earth. And the middle of the earth is usually described as the fertile, life-engendering Aryan expanses, which occur on the banks of the Dareja, the Daitya, and the Aras rivers, if not the shorelines of the Caspian Sea. According to various post-Gathic sources, that is, sources that were created during the literate phase of Persian history, this good land of the Aryans is associated with sacred rivers and lakes, within which homa plants thrive, as do Maza's adversaries, the Druj, when they penetrate the roots of the vulnerable tree of immortal life. And of course, habitats of such type are indistinguishable from the fertile lowlands of Vedic Soma in the Punjab, i.e. one of Mazda's good lands, known as the Hapta Hindu, the land of the seven rivers. The lotus swamp seen here can easily be envisaged as a lotus tanks found somewhere on the Deccan Plateau of central India. But, in fact, it happens to be a coastal swamp on the southern shorelines of the Caspian Sea that receives fresh waters directly from the north slopes of the Alborz mountain range. And this would be in Iran, the land of the Aryans. Surviving records of the Mazda worshippers are less helpful in ascertaining the botanical characteristics of the homa plant than are the Vedas in characterizing Soma, mostly because these scriptures are mythical in content and now highly fragmented and incomplete. But we shall find that the mythical traits of Homa are actually perfectly consistent with those of Soma, of the Aryans that lived in India. Since most of what we know about the Homa plant is based on mythical and metaphorical allusions to the plant, the best and perhaps only way to test or to confirm our interpretations of scriptural imagery is to consider artistic images from Iran's archaeological record. Various scriptural sources use alternative names for the Homa plant, for example, some of which can be perhaps interpreted in terms of the plant's botanical features. One such name is the Go-Karena plant, meaning the oxhorn plant, Go meaning oxen and Karena referring to the creature's horns. This is an intriguing title for the Homa plant, insofar as the most prominent plant motif that we encounter among the ruins of Persepolis are those massive lotus columns, most of which support two opposing heads and chests of a pair of long-horned cows. This cow and plant symbolism is implied in various different mythic contexts, most deriving from allusions to the Homa beverage as having milky qualities. Over 100 lotus columns were erected at Persepolis, so the unmistakable bullhorn plant at this famous site is apparently the Sacred Lotus. And interestingly, this same plant and animal symbolic association is encountered throughout South Asia as well, where the Sanskrit term Gokarna the equivalent of Persia's Gokarna, is a title that applies, in fact, to the classical Hindu lotus god known as Shiva or Rudra. Or just as well, Gokarna refers to a famous lotus tank, a tirtha, situated on the banks of the hallowed Sarasvati River of Vedic India, where, it seems, Shiva's phallus, his lingam, and his immortalizing seed, symbolizing Soma, is said to arise from the Gokarna lotus tank. Later Mazdian texts refer to the Persian tree of life as the Gokard plant, just another cognate of this term, and claim that this plant thrives within the waters of the mythical Vorukasha ocean, and that it springs from this mythic body of water to confer immortality on the Aryan nations. So it seems quite curious to me that while modern historians have long equated the mythical Vorukasha ocean with the Caspian Sea, they very rarely, if ever, have recognized the scriptural connections between Persia's tree of life and the shorelines of Central Asia's largest body of water, the Caspian Sea. Or if not from the banks of the Vorukasha, other scriptures identify the homa-plant source as the sacred Daitya and Aredvi rivers, or also lakes Asvat and Lake Kasava. A text that dates from the Sasanian period, around the 3rd century AD, the Bundahishn, sheds some additional light on a number of critical features of the homa-plant. The cosmological themes of this relatively late text borrow directly from mythical subjects in the most ancient of Zoroastrian records, the sacred prehistoric Gathas. These hymns draw a close allegorical connection between the sacrificial homa-plant and the sacrificial oxen, who goes by the name of Gosirvar originally, this title meaning literally cow plant or soul of the cow. To quote the words of the Bundahishn, on the nature of the tree they call Gokard, it says in Revelation that it was the first day when the tree they call Gokard grew in the deep mud within the wide-formed ocean. And it is necessary as a producer of the renovation of the universe, for they prepare the cosmos' immortality with that plant. In other passages, a similar substance is identified as hush, this presumably being the equivalent of the Vedic word kush, a name for India's soma plant sap. But in these passages, the drink comes not from the tree of life, but directly from the sacrificial holy cow, called the Hadhayos ox, which is said to have arisen upon, or from within, the aquatic bullhorn plant, the Gokarna, not vice versa, as would be the mythic norm. So again, to quote the Bundahishn, when the seeds of these plants, with those from the primeval ox, have arisen up, every year the bird strips that tree and mingles all the seeds in the water. The god Tistar seizes them with the rainwater and rains them onto all the regions. Near to that tree, the white home, the healing and undefiled, has grown at the source of the water of Aredvi Sur, this being the name of a rivering goddess or river, Aredvi Sur. Everyone who eats it becomes immortal, and they call it the Gokard tree, as it is said that home is expelling death. Also, in the renovation of the universe, they prepare its immortality therefrom, and it is the chief of all plants. Now, the only plant in the arts of ancient Persia that is associated with a cow, especially among the Achaemenian ruins of Persepolis and Susa, is the Sacred Lotus of India. And there are hundreds of examples of this association, because almost every lotus capital that once sustained the pillared halls at these famous Zoroastrian sites are surmounted with a pair of back-to-back horned bovids with lotus gardens strung around their necks. One of the few remaining bullhorn lotus capitals from Persepolis is conserved and displayed at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. But a more complete specimen of the bullhorn plant is found at the Louvre, where even though the lotus capital platform is missing, the horns and ears of the cosmic bull are still intact. Stone carvers of King Darius also anchored their colossal lotus columns to the palace foundations with upturned lotus capital bases on the ground. So we have a morass of lotus capitals on the ground and an equal number of them in the rafters of the grandiose pavilion. A holy scene, to be sure, within which mortals claimed that they enjoyed the pleasures of becoming immortal. Decorative sculpting on these column bases indicate, once again, Egyptian influences. Smaller lotus-style palmettes surround the upper rim of the base, while downward pointed buds form a perianth of lotus petals to decorate the lower rim. And bearing in mind the scale and number of these columnar features, one can only imagine just how sensational it must have been to participate in these religious processions. Thousands of worshippers ascended the great meeting hall of Darius with libations and entered the mythic world of Ahura Mazda to bring their vision into clearer focus. It is perhaps worth remembering at this juncture that prehistoric Aryan chants of India also likened the soma-plant to both a bull and to a cow. So the quaffing of the elixir of immortality in India was equated with the drinking of a cosmic bull's semen, referred to as retas, or a cosmic cow's milk. We also make the observation in our episodes on Vedic Soma that Indo-Aryan priests often describe the process of expressing the plant's sap from its stems as a milking process, because soma stems produced a milky latex. And so the golden soma plant of India was often likened, metaphorically, to a golden udder that flowed with a milky elixir of immortality. A very early seal from Mesopotamia, whose specific provenance is unknown, reveals this general theme rather poignantly. We see here a divine man and a minotaur figure, a bull man, who take command of two obviously virile bulls that seem to direct their seminal discharges toward a tree of life motif. There are many mythic traditions of the Middle East that refer to their gods and trees of life as bulls, but this archetypal motif was not restricted to Tigris-Euphrates civilizations. The same symbolic relationship is observed in Egypt, in the Mediterranean, and among South Asian religious traditions as well. In a region that borders the northwestern extremes of Media, the ancient kingdom of Urartu, that would be Ararat of Hebrew scribes, which now pertains to eastern Turkey, a bronze plaque was unearthed from the famous digs of Toprakali near Lake Van, where a Persian-styled cosmic bull kneels beside a sun-like tree of life on a world mountain. This combination of symbolic elements seems to mirror various Iranian mythic themes that describe the sun-like qualities of a homa-plant on a world mountain. And we note that a silver drinking vessel from the same region also draws direct associations between Ahura Mazda, his splendorous Havareno, his shine, a cosmic bull, and stylized lotus buds and blossoms that surround the Creator and his creations. And do bear in mind that Urartu was home to a number of pastoral tribes, including the Cimmerians, the Scythians, the Hittites, Mytanians, and the Medians, various groups of which are recognized in the historical record to be Homa drinkers. A pair of similar creatures stand guard over the so-called Gateway of All Nations that Xerxes erected at Persepolis, this modern name for the structure deriving from the many different peoples of Central Asia that would convene in their regional garbs to celebrate Homa drinking rituals. But this creature is unlikely a portrayal of the Gathic holy cow known as Gosirvan, but rather seems to be a peculiar hybrid beast that goes by the name of Gopat Shah, the Iranian equivalent of the Brahmanic divine title of Gopati, which means Lord of the Cows, which was assumed by Krishna, primarily in classical Hindu mythology. The king of cows, or the lord of cows, Gopatsha, is said to stand among homa-plants on the banks of the famous river Daiti in the land of Gokpato. Like the tree of life, Gopatsha, the lord of cows, is an immortal being, and he bears the body of a bull and the torso of a man in Scripture. A relatively obscure text known as the Minogi Krad, meaning the spirit of wisdom, states that Gopatsha guards the tree of life, where the immortal golden eagle of Persian tradition, the Saina, a term that means eagle, constructs her nest. Here we have the shared mythic roles of a cosmic eagle and a bull, where the Bovid protector places his powerful lion paws upon a stylized lotus stalk. Note here how the lotus tree of life motif at Persepolis match the vegetative motifs that surround the image of a Zoroastrian eagle that is seen nesting upon the homa-plant, and that the lotus perianth seems to represent the raptor's nest. That some of the lotus capitals at Persepolis replace the horned oxen figures with a pair of eagle heads seems to relate to these same scriptural inferences. And I might add here as well that Vedic verses also refer to Soma as being a nest for the Saina, the Sanskrit eagle, cosmic eagle. As to the origins of divine cow imagery in the Middle East, a particularly exquisite drinking vessel that suggests a very ancient relationship between the holy cow and libation rituals in Central Asia dates as far back as 5,000 years ago. So this drinking vessel takes us deep into the pre-literate past of Central Asia. But of course, one cannot say with certitude that this object once served as a homa vessel. Nevertheless, vessels of later origin seem to reflect cow and lotus symbolism connections with remarkable precision. An Achaemenian drinking vessel from Persepolis establishes, for example, a direct connection between the bullhorn lotus capital of Persepolis and homa drinking rituals. The details of this vessel's bull handle are indistinguishable from the bull busts that surmount the lotus capitals at Persepolis. Moreover, an almost identical libation vessel that was made from silver replaces the holy cow with a different milk-bearing creature, that being a goat. But here the creature forms the base of a raiton, while the vessel's mouth is decorated with the symbol of immortal life, a lotus bud and blossom meander. As we can see here, the Asian lion was almost as popular as the bull in Asian lotus symbolism, and both seem to serve as protector spirits of the sacred plant. The cow and the ram have been replaced here with the torso of a winged, roaring lion that stands vigilant in front of a lotus bud and blossom motif. As we've already noted, this creature is observed throughout Asia as a protector of a Persian-styled lotus tree of life at Persepolis. And note here that this divine protector has a man's head that is crowned with a lotus flower. We can be assured that this is the same winged lion we encounter on ancient Buddhist stupas at Bharut and Sanchi in India 3 centuries later, for these images were created by stoneworkers of the famous King Ashoka, an Indian dynast that maintained close contacts with Persian kings during his entire life. And this relationship derives from the control that Darius, Artaxerxes, and the Zoroastrian Magi once held over the Haptad Sindhu, the Punjab of northwestern India. And in fact, Ashoka often employed Persian script to record his well-known edicts on massive Persepolitan Lotus Columns at a number of very important Buddhist sites. As we noted earlier, the lines that stand upon Ashoka's lotus pillar are stylistically Persepolitan in physical constitution and Persepolitan in symbolic meaning. A variation on this symbolic lion, the wings much reduced in this case, lunges between an Iranian lotus bud and flower motif on a silver fragment that probably predates the construction of Persepolis, this particular specimen dating from the 8th to 5th centuries BC. Another source of evidence that supports the Lotus hypothesis for Homa's botanical identity comes from a famous hoard of gold objects that were uncovered on the banks of the Oxus River, also known as the Amu Darya River in modern Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. These revealing pieces are thought to date from the Achaemenian era, perhaps 23 to 2,500 years ago, and include around 180 informative specimens of gold leaf impressions and figurines that were excavated from a single hoard. Several pieces portray hooded human figures, these representing the Atravans, or the fire priests of the Median order of Magi. They hold either bundled homa stems in hand, the barsum, or lotus flowers. And when we consider the size, dimension, and the uniform straightness and stoutness of these stems that form the barsum on the banks of the Oxus River, we can be sure that they do not belong to a water lily, since the stalks of water lilies are supple during flourishing and contorted during fruition. We must acknowledge, therefore, that these straight and stout stems, which obviously lack leaves or joints, and bear no resemblance whatsoever to any other plant candidate that has been identified as Homa, such as the joint pine, the pomegranate, or Syrian rue. But they do match precisely the general size and shape of leafless lotus stalks that arise from the rivers and lakes of Central Asia. Now you grow of milky whiteness, and now you grow golden, and forth your healing liquors flow for the inspiration of the pious. An almost identical barsum is observed in a royal scene near Kermanshah and the Zagros Mountains of central Iran, where the sun god Mithra holds up homa stems to consecrate the ascension of King Ardashir II. The scene seems to apply generally to a passage from the Mihir, that's the Mithra Yast, which identifies Mithra as the first of all gods to lift up the Homa branches, in stating, and I quote, "Hail to Mithra, the Lord of wide pastures, who has 1,000 ears and 10,000 eyes," much as did Soma and Mithra in the Vedas. "Hail to the man who shall offer you a sacrifice, with the holy wood in his hand, the barsum in his hand, the holy meat in his hand, the holy mortar in his hand, with his hands well washed, with the mortar well washed, with the bundles of barsum tied up, the hauma uplifted, and the hahuna vaidiyas sung through." Most importantly, we should recognize that the stout and straight stalks of uniform size apparently come from the plant on which the radiant Persian sun god is seen standing upon the Asian lotus, Nelumbu nucifera. Just as Surya, the Vedic Indo-Aryan sun god, in Indian iconography, typically stands upright on a lotus flower with 2 lotus shoots held high, Surya's Persian solar equivalent, Mithra, strikes here a similar pose, but with a bundle of homa stalks in hand, without their flowers. Another gold specimen from the Oxus River treasure portrays a hooded median priest with a flower that is larger than a man's hand, and a barsum stem bundle in the other. The telltale upside-down conical structure in the middle of the flower represents no doubt the unique golden seed receptacle of India's Sacred Lotus. And yet another gold leaf specimen depicts a crowned king with a large flower in hand, this too representing a lotus, no doubt plucked 2,500 years ago from the banks of the Oxus River, which tradition recognizes as one of the good lands of Ahura Mazda and Aryan Veg. Now, it is widely acknowledged that Persepolis descriptions of Homa's euphoric effects on the human body and mind are identical to those that were attributed to Vedic Soma. Homa endowed priest guilds with health and longevity, with prosperity, vigor, and truth, and, well, various other spiritual powers. To quote the Achaemenian, the madha of Homa, meaning the honey-like sap or maddening bliss of the homa-plant, is accomplished by its own asha, rightfulness. So women were made fertile by the plant and gained confidence in giving birth to righteous sons if they prepared their bodies with the plant saps while they were gestating. Other desirable effects of the inebriant included the enhancement of strength, courage, bliss, and sensations of exhilaration and immortality. The Homa experience described in a Sasanian text entitled the Ardhaviras Name suggests the plant may also have produced hallucinatory visions, perceptions of one's own omniscience, and apparently a profound sensation of inner peace. And, of course, all of these effects are perfectly consistent with those attributed to the soma-plant in the famous Upanishads of prehistoric India. So, in conclusion, Persepolis imagery, from the birth of the Achaemenian Empire to the turn of the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, makes abundantly clear that the Sacred Lotus of the Far East was essentially the sole vegetative or floral motif that is encountered in temple imagery of the Mazda worshippers. That this same plant was widely associated with barsum bundles, stem bundles, and drinking implements only lends credence to my hypothesis that the homa-plant was the sacred lotus, as does the fact that Persian metaphors relating to the homa-plant are almost entirely consistent with those of Soma and the Indian lotus. And for those doubters that are still unconvinced of my botanical hypothesis, another source of botanical data can be garnered from the mythic narratives of Mazda worshippers, which employ a number of allegorical themes and details to describe the cosmogonic roles of the plant in living creation. These too will make clear, I believe, in a separate podcast, that the plant in question was a sun-like plant that grew among dark and surly underwater dragons in the aquatic underworld of Persian rivers and lakes. This being the case, the mythic record pretty much bears up the same conclusions that we find in the iconographic records of ancient Iran. Just as the heavenly paradise of the gods in Indo-Aryan tradition was envisaged as a lotus field that was reached by means of a devayana, a path of the gods, to paradise, a similar destination was anticipated by Mazda worshippers. Persian Aryans focus their attentions, however, on a golden and resplendent paradise for immortalized Homa drinkers, rather than Soma drinkers, within what they refer to as the House of Song, the Garunmana paradise. That would be the original Paididesa, paradise of the gods. Iranian mythology returns often to a mythic theme that relates to a divine inheritance, an inheritance that apparently is as easy to lose as it is to acquire. A well-known early text of the younger Avesta, the Samyad Yasht, is a liturgy that describes how Mazda's divine offspring have come to receive, and then to lose, possession of their Creator's sun-like golden splendor. This golden splendor of Ahura Mazda is described as kingly glory, or as divine grace, by the term kavaim havreno, or just to the term havar. That latter term, havar, is obviously cognate with the Sanskrit term svar, meaning to shine in gold. But in Sanskrit terms, this shine can apply to either solar spirits, solar gods, or to the resplendent features of the immortalizing plant god known as Soma Pavamana in Indian tradition. The golden light of Soma, Svar, is responsible for enlightening this god's worshippers. And interestingly, Persian tradition also attributes the same splendor to both the sun and their psychotropic plant of the gods, Homa. Golden was the radiance of Soma in Indo-Aryan hymns, and golden was the light that radiated from the eye of the plant god Soma. So in keeping with Aryan traditions throughout the world, golden also was the color of the Perso-Aryan creator and associated sky gods. And golden was the color of Persia's proverbial tree of life, as well as the cosmic all-knowing eyes of the creator of that tree, and that would be the eyes of Ahura Mazda. That shining aura can be shared with mortals, in that Havareno, which derives from the Foruhar, shining disk of Ahura Mazda, shines above the head of Prophet Zarathustra on the day of his birth, and as well throughout his life, which might be expected of a high priest and the first human being to instruct humankind on the methods of performing a Homa sacrifice in Persian tradition. The seal that you observe here was extracted from the palaces of Darius at Persepolis, and it establishes some obviously symbolic connections between the shining and gloriously golden aura of Ahura Mazda in his Foruhar and the flower that the god uplifts. The flower has apparently been plucked from the solitary stalk of a lotus plant and is observed standing here erect, along with the massive lotus columns that sustain the roofs of Persepolitan sanctuaries during the day of the seal's elaboration. The splendorous glory of Mazda, Havareno, as signified by the Foruhar, endows Mazda's solar offspring with a divine sort of strength and intelligence that enables them to stand tenaciously against the onslaughts of devas and non-Aryan nations. So there's a political dimension to this as well, a geopolitical military dimension. The first shining divine offspring of Mazda in Zoroastrian cosmology, 6 in number, amounting to 7 splendorous beings when you include Ahura Mazda himself, essentially the 7 sages of Indo-European tradition. These beings are referred to as the Amesha Spentas, which most translators of Mazdian scriptures render as either the bounteous or the benevolent immortals. These were the first divine beings to inherit Mazda's kingly glory when the earth and sky were created, but they were not to be the last divine heirs to the glory. Mazda is generous in sharing his glory with mythic dragon slayers, and his Havareno is used to prepare them for their confrontation with underworld serpent demons in rivers and lakes of ancient Iran. For Havareno is the quintessential power of the cosmos, an inexhaustible source of bright glory that restores Mazda's creations to immortality. Or to quote the Samyad Yasht, "Unto the kingly glory, the Havareno, we offer up libations. The Homa and meat, the stem bundle, the wisdom of the tongue, holy spells, speech, deeds, libations, and rightly spoken words." So clearly, the Creator's splendor is connected to Homa drinking rituals, if not to the plant itself in Scripture, and no less so in Iranian and Central Asian symbolism and iconography. This particular refrain calls to mind a tiled relief on Darius's palace at Susa that portrays the Foruhar with a golden disc and golden wings shining above its 2 guardian figures, these being golden sphinx-like creatures, but of a Persian's persuasion. Note that they also have golden wings and golden lotus crowns. Now, historical scenes that are carved in low relief on the walls and facades of the audience halls at Persepolis indicate that provincial rulers and dignitaries of Darius played an active role in libation ceremonies, along with his emissaries from India, from Bactria, the Near East, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, all of whom would arrive at Persepolis in their native garb to partake in these hallowed rites. While stone reliefs that portray these vessels on temple grounds often lack sufficient detail to ascertain the contents of the vessels, the ritual setting and context of the processions suggests the communal practice of homa drinking rituals. And since a large portion of the libation accoutrements are decorated with lotus rosettes and bud and blossom motifs, and quite frequently in the medium of gold, one is inclined to conclude that these decorative flourishes must have something to do with the contents of the vessels. A close-up view of a participant in Darius's procession presents, for example, a pair of vase-like amphoras with two handles that are fashioned as winged cows, these being one of various symbolic creatures that typically protects lotus blossoms that spring from the Aryan tree of life motifs in both Mesopotamia and Iran. A typical vessel of similar size and shape from the grounds of Persepolis exhibits lotus petal flutings at the base and a lotus bud and flower meander around the throat of the gold urn. A number of the so-called immortals that march in line across the temple walls of Persepolis carry specimens of similar standard-issue wide-mouthed bowls. We note that one of these vessels, in low relief, bears the faint markings of petaloid flutings that radiate from the bottom of the bowl. And interestingly, numerous bowls of such type have been recovered from Persepolis and various other Central Asian sites, the petaloid fluting suggesting a lotus perianth, from which the immortalizing drink of the gods is given to human immortals. Darius himself once employed a bowl of such type that was fashioned out of pure gold. A golden rosette is observed in the center of the bowl, while the surrounding flutings seem to suggest a radial arrangement of stylized petals. A variation on this theme is observed on another gold bowl from Persepolis, but this specimen exhibits a lotus bud and blossom runner that surrounds the bowl, this motif connoting the eternal recurrence of lotus flowers, and thus suggesting a symbol of eternal life in Persia, as well as from this motif's place of origin, which is Egypt. In fact, we first encounter bud and blossom lotus motifs in Egypt some 5,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years before it migrated to Mesopotamia, and then onward to Iran by around 600 BC. An almost identical silver bowl reproduces a similar arrangement of lotus symbols. And since these ritual implements were apparently used by kings and often fashioned out of pure gold as well, we can be sure they played a key role in the spiritual lives of Mazda worshippers, and that the lotus plant had something to do with the exhilarating contents of this sacrament. Scriptural references to the use of homa vessels in the homios proclaim, "From the silver cup I pour thee into the golden chalice," between which refrains are interspersed, "Thus spoke Zarathustra, praise be to Homa, Mazda maid." So could these vessels be anything but homa drinking implements? And if so, how is it possible that art historians have never considered that these floral bowls from Persepolis might have something to do with homa's botanical identity? That soma kailashas, the soma drinking vessels of Indian tradition, are also decorated with lotus flower engravings only further support the identification of homa/soma as the Sacred Lotus in South Asia and in Persia. Although animal symbolism can vary considerably among Persian sites, as it can in Persian mythology, plant symbolism is actually simple and quite conservative. During the age of the Achaemenian Empire, the Sacred Lotus is the only plant that is portrayed, in fact, on libation vases. perhaps an occasional palm tree, but rarely so. Or indeed, it is the only plant known in religious imagery that covers the walls, the staircases, and ramparts of Persepolis. Since Median men that dominate the stone reliefs at Persepolis are dressed in garb and headdresses of the magi, that is, the Homa-drinking priests, it only follows that libation vessels portrayed on Darius's palaces were involved in Homa-drinking rituals. And as we now know, there is but one plant that is featured on these ritual implements, and that would be the Sacred Lotus. This observation seems all the more relevant when we recognize that mortars, pestles, and drinking vessels of ancient India and Southeast Asia are also conventionally decorated with the same plant, images of the same plant, some relevant details of which are covered in our episodes on Hinduism and Buddhism.